I am James Surowiecki, and to my left is Scott Hemphill, who is a law professor at Columbia, and to my further left is Kal Raustiala, who's a law professor at UCLA. And what we are going to talk about today is what Kal calls the Piracy Paradox. It's sort of began this panel sort of began with an article that Kal and, I'm sorry, who was the other?
Chris Sprigman.
Okay, wrote in the University of Virginia Law Review, an article essentially arguing that knockoffs are good for the fashion industry. Now, this runs very counter to what a lot of people in the fashion industry will tell you. In fact, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, which is sort of the trade organization for fashion designers, has been working quite hard this year, and previously, but this year, sort of they actually got hearings in Congress and on trying to get copyright protection for fashion designs, which they currently do not have. And Kal's argument, in some sense, was that this was both unnecessary and perhaps a bad idea as kind of a matter of public policy, but also paradoxically, thus the piracy paradox, could be bad for the industry as a whole. And what we're going to do today is talk about that and kind of broader issues of intellectual property. One of the reasons why this is an interesting subject, beyond the fact that we're all interested in knockoffs in one form or another, I think, is that it deals with a subject, intellectual property, that has become increasingly important to the U.S. economy, the global economy more general, and also increasingly kind of mainstream in the sense that the issues that are involved with intellectual property are ones that we all deal with now on a relatively daily basis. Obviously, it's at the heart of things like music downloads and the effect of the internet on the music industry, the film industry, and so on. But more broadly speaking, intellectual property, you could say, kind of pervades almost every aspect of economic life these days. So we'll probably try to deal with some of those issues as well. This is going to be a little different from most of the other panels or discussions in the sense that this is going to be a little more of a debate because Kal and Scott do not exactly necessarily agree with each other all the way down. So there'll probably be maybe some fisticuffs to spark up the thing. But I think I'll start just by asking Kal, why don't you just explain what the piracy paradox is and why you think it exists?
Sure. So I got interested in this issue because I think, as everyone here knows, we often see dresses, let's say, appear at the Oscars, and then very soon after, you can purchase them online quite cheaply. We've all been, I'm guessing, to H&M, Zara, Topshop, companies like these. And so I was interested in why is this possible? Because the typical view, as Jim said, is that without copyright protection, creators won't create, right? Authors won't write, musicians won't create music. And nonetheless, when you look at the fashion industry, you see an enormous amount of creativity. So I tried to understand, well, how is this possible, given what we lawyers think is a necessary element? And I think you ably summarized it. The idea is that, unlike other industries, in fashion, we all know there's a fashion cycle. Things come into fashion, they come out of fashion. And one of the ways that they go out of style is that they diffuse into the marketplace. So it starts off with something, let's say Prada, designs, and then slowly kind of disseminates out to the masses. And when that happens, people want to move on. In fact, Miucci Prada once said, "We let others copy, and then we drop it," right? And so my argument is that the copying that takes place doesn't harm in the way that we think normally it should harm the creator. In fact, it makes it incentivizes the creator to go out and create more and enables them to sell more to the consumer, right? So each season you're buying another dress, another suit, another tie, whatever it may be. And so it's paradoxically beneficial.
Well, let me, I want to get to you in a second, Scott, but let me just draw out a couple questions actually. The first is that your assumption is that in the absence of copying, that people would be more likely to hang on, to stay with the same design, wear the same clothes for a longer period of time?
Well, yeah, because it would be harder to, well, a couple of things. One, if we think about trends, right? Trends are an essential part of fashion. Well, what is a trend? A trend is a series of things that look kind of alike. Right? And so one of the problems with having copyright protection is you would make trends very hard to happen.
Right.
You'd eliminate that. But yeah, there'd be slower turnover.
Okay.
Now, we don't really know this for sure, but that's our intuition.
Now, the second thing is that you're also making the argument that in some ways the audiences for these two things, the audience that's buying a knockoff at H&M or at Zara, is fundamentally different from the audience that's actually buying the Prada design at the Prada store.
Right. Most of the time, I think that's true. Though again, we often see wealthy people shopping at H&M,
right,
and sometimes vice versa. But it's not unknown. But one way to look at it too, we were talking over lunch about this, is that you can think about the H&M version. We'll just use H&M. It's kind of like a gateway drug, right?
Okay.
It's where people start off, they buy the look, and then they maybe move on up. And
right.
That's why you maybe see designers like Stella McCartney offering lines through Target, through H&M, through other discount chains.
Okay, Scott, is Kal right?
No. So I got interested in this actually from Kal's article with Chris, and with a colleague of mine at Harvard, Jeannie Suk, we've started to take a closer look at the argument and about the merits of the case for intellectual property protection for fashion designs more generally. And I think this argument, you guys call it a kind of induced obsolescence argument, is extremely seductive. It's almost a kind of Freakonomics of fashion, in a way. Right? And the counterintuition, in theory, I think, could possibly be correct. But
so we agree.
So I think there are a couple of pretty important buts here, and the buts
theory, not reality,
may swallow the degree of agreement. The first is that when you actually go out in the world, I'm not sure how often it is that, in fact, the H&M version of the high-end fashion design actually ends up resulting in its obsolescence. I mean, we might actually look to a direct analogy. We're not talking here about knockoff Louis Vuitton bags, for example, but that's actually kind of an interesting example here. To my knowledge, it hasn't been the experience so far that the flooding into the market of knockoff bags, lower quality, same design, has substantially contributed to their being pushed onto the next design. Now, something else that I think is important here is that quite aside from the induced obsolescence argument, there are a lot of other dynamics at work here that I think may ultimately be more important, and there's two that I want to focus on. One is that I think if you talk to designers, they actually see their competitive challenge in terms of coming up with the next latest new thing as being their rivals who are also high-end designers. Right. Not so much the H&Ms of the world, but the Narciso Rodriguez's, right? And the second thing is, I think we need to be careful not to underestimate the degree to which traditional purchasers of high-end goods are quite comfortable mix and matching at H&M or at Zara or where have you. And on the other side, the extent to which folks who might not otherwise be buying up are in fact trading up, are spiking on a single or a couple of items. I mean, it's a huge trend.
But are you concerned that in the absence of copyright protection, well, one of the reasons why the demand for copyright protection does seem a bit perplexing is that there's really you'd be hard-pressed to look at the luxury goods industry or high-end fashion over the last decade and say, they're in real trouble. That's a business that's really having a hard time, getting by. Unlike the music industry, where you can actually say, we can argue about whether or not downloads are the reason, but you can certainly look at the music industry's revenues and say, that's an industry that is in trouble. Right. The high-end luxury goods industry and the fashion industry in particular, sales have risen, astronomically much faster than most other businesses over the last 5 or 6 years. They've had the recession had almost no impact on them. They, the weak dollar has had surprisingly little effect. So it's not, what exactly is the economic harm that's being done? I mean, is it just that the profits are not as massive as they would otherwise be, basically?
So I think ultimately the risk that we need to care about is a risk to both the amount of innovation that we see in the industry, and also, and I think maybe even more importantly, to the kinds of innovation that we see. So let me just take each of these. In terms of the amount, I think we're starting to see some, since this is a conversation in part about the near future, it's worth thinking about what's new in this industry. The rise of mass fashion, of copyists that can copy in bulk and quickly and get products to market faster than the high-end designers can, is new. Copying is not new. Copying is an old issue. But copying en masse is new. And that runs a substantial risk of reducing the returns on innovation that a Narciso Rodriguez or some other designer. Secondly, and to my mind maybe a little bit more interestingly, there's also a question of what kinds of innovation ends up taking place. So today, although a fashion design is not itself copyrighted, as you said, the interlocked LV bag pattern is trademarked, and a pattern, a copyrighted pattern, can also get protection. What that does, I think, is distort innovation in the direction of established players. We tend to see a kind of logoification to some degree of fashion that's a subject of some concern, and which relatedly ends up leaving independent designers out in the cold. Folks who don't have trademarks or brand image in order to protect their designs, and who see themselves being copied easily and rampantly without any recourse.
Okay, so Kal, one of the things you said was, you said slowly diffuse when you laid out your model. No, it's important because actually, obviously, one of the challenges that is being offered in response to your argument is that actually, even if it was once slow, it's no longer slow, that it's now fast, that things come down the runway on, Fashion Week in New York, and basically the designs are copied, they're sent to the factory in China, and they come back. And does speed change things? I mean, does the ability that, in some cases, the story that people will tell is that the copies hit the stores before the actual designs do?
Yeah, I think speed does change things to some degree, and I think you see. So first of all, you mentioned the bill before Congress. There is a bill, but this is the 10th, 15th bill since 1970s. So it's not the first time.
Bill that's been attempted
to create some kind of protection for fashion designers. It's been a long-standing idea. So there's nothing necessarily. It's pre-internet. But the internet changes things a little bit. On the other hand, the speed. There's a point at which this argument doesn't really work. So the idea that, in fact, the copyists get it to the store faster. Well, I think that does happen on occasion, but they have to be incredibly prescient to know, well, what is going to be the trend? Nobody knows what's going to be the trend next year. And if you did, you'd be a fantastic buyer for Bloomingdale's. So there's a way in which, yes, that happens, but I think it's limited. And again, I guess I go back to the point you made earlier, which is the industry is doing great. And so when we think about intellectual property, the American tradition has always been we intervene with property rights to incentivize creativity that wouldn't happen otherwise. We do it as a market intervention because it distorts competition, as Scott said, but we do it gingerly, carefully. And we have to see some evidence for that, and we don't really.
We have to see some evidence that it's actually causing harm.
Exactly.
Okay, that was a little.
No, let me just add one thing, if I can. I do agree there are individual designers who get harmed, and I'm very sympathetic to them. But again, when we craft public policy, we want to think across.
Okay, I want to.
Can I jump in just
one? No, wait. Before you do, I want to delegalize what you said a little bit because it's actually important. I mean, one of the things that might be curious, depending on how well versed you are in intellectual property law, is that we're talking about the effect of intellectual property on innovation. That's the focus. In other words, does copyright create more innovation or less innovation? And the reason for that is that what Kal was talking about is that in the American tradition, unlike the European tradition, we do not have this concept of the moral right of the creator. In other words, we don't assume that just because you invent something, you automatically should be able to control whatever happens to it forever, basically. We have limited copyright, limited patents, and so on. In Europe, by contrast, in most European countries, there is this idea of kind of the moral right, so that you essentially, no one can even tinker with anything you do, a text that you write or anything. And so the focus in the United States has historically been, as Kal said, on what is the practical effect? So the clause in the Constitution basically says, provides for the creation of patent and copyrights to promote the useful progress of the arts and sciences. That's the focus. And so that's kind of the question about what we're, in a sense, debating here is what is most likely to promote the useful progress of arts and sciences. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, this is just a modest point with respect to what Kal had said. On the idea of prescience, I think part of what helps improve the impression of prescience is that post-runway, pre-arrival in your stores of an item, there's a set of buyers who make decisions. And it's possible to free ride on the buzz that's being built around particular designs so that Zara and H&M have a heads up with some advance quite a bit prior to when it hits the stores. Now, it's possible to say, well, why doesn't Prada just go fast the same as H&M? And part of what matters here is because a designer is often using a custom fabric or more expensive materials, securing those takes takes a lot more time. And so if you're willing to put it in any kind of material, it's a lot faster.
Now, is there any Cal, is there any empirical work on the kind of well, you mentioned the trading up phenomenon. So people, this is this sort of argument that people are now, saving money on buying Walmart for these things and then buying a couple things. But is there any empirical evidence on the other side, like how much of an overlap there is in terms of the trading down, people buying at Prada but also going to H&M or Zara for? I mean, if you read women's magazines, they'll talk about.
They talk about it.
Yeah, but is there any? I mean, I don't know what the empirical evidence would be, but no. So we don't really know what the crossover basically is between those things. Okay,
one interesting piece of empirical evidence that might bear on the debate, we were talking about this a little bit before we came up, was back in the 30s. We have one data point about U.S. intellectual property protection, and this is, back in the 30s, there was a guild. All of the fashion, they were called originators at the time, all the fashion designers got together and said to retailers, look, if you buy from copyists, this was before H&M and single brand retailers, if you buy from copyists, we're going to boycott you entirely. And they came to heel. They
red carded them.
They were red carded, yes.
So they did.
No, the red carding is terrific, right?
Yeah.
And this lasted for 5 or 6 years until it was shut down. It being a joint boycott, it was seen as an illegal restraint of trade and violated antitrust law. But there's at least limited evidence, I think, that at the time that this was happening, the folks that used to be copyists became designers. Now, designers in maybe only a modest way. Right? I mean, they were no doubt riffs on existing works, and that's fine, right? I think that would satisfy pretty much everybody in the debate. But it's a little piece of evidence.
But what does that mean, though? I mean, one of the questions that this obviously raises, I mean, the bill that was before Congress actually provided for only 2 years of copyright protection. So it was not, was it 3?
3.
Okay, 3 years of copyright protection. So it's not the same as, say, a book or whatever, or Walt Disney has on Mickey Mouse. But obviously part of the question is, do we really want people to be able to copyright the pinstripe or the stiletto heel? I mean, would that really be... I mean, a lot of innovation in every realm involves recombining existing ideas and extending them. And one of my concerns is that, you basically allow people to say, okay, anytime you use a pinstripe, you have to give me, whatever, 2 cents or something like that. It seems like there would be less innovation going on.
Yeah, a copyright on a pinstripe would certainly be troubling. And I think there is an open question...
Especially to lawyers. Right?
Well, and there's an open question about whether...
Right.
I think there's an open question about whether men's apparel,
in general, could
there's not a lot of variation.
Yeah, we all... it's such a radical difference here between us. Yeah.
But I do think that figuring out the extent to which upstream protection is going to limit downstream or later recombinations is crucial in this area as in the usual copyright context.
Right.
I think the best that can be said here is that the proposals for protection are extremely narrow. They're duplicates of extremely distinctive dress designs, handbag designs, and not...
The problem, though, isn't the problem, though, that the history of intellectual property in the United States is a history of expansion? Once people get intellectual property rights, so copyright goes from whatever it was, 20 to 75 to 75 plus life of author to every time Disney's copyright on Mickey Mouse is about to expire, they get Congress to extend it, basically. I mean, it's literally true in a sense, right? So I think that's part of the concern. But we only have a few more minutes, or 2 minutes. So, Cal, I just wanted you to actually close maybe by saying something about other examples where intellectual property is similarly kind of strange, because it's sort of interesting that fashion isn't the only area where you have this weird mix.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been trying to look at is these other creative endeavors. So we heard from 3 chefs yesterday, and we ate their food last night. As many of you know, chefs create dishes, and then they go off, and those dishes seem to migrate to other restaurants, right? And so there's no real protection for the built food, or for recipes, for that matter. So cuisine is another example where chefs are very creative, and we live in an incredibly creative time for food, but there's no real protection for that. Perfumes, you can buy these perfumes, smells like Chanel No. 5. Magicians and their tricks, comedians and their jokes, right? So there's this whole set of creative endeavors where people somehow manage to keep creating in the absence of copyright protection. And so I'm drawn to that and trying to understand, what is it that links these things? Is there some underlying connection? And I think the biggest question is, what does it tell us about the importance of intellectual property? And I just want to go back to something
legal protections.
Legal protections.
Right.
Because as Jim pointed out, the trend of the last 100 years has been to expand these protections, and Congress is very happy to do that. So we think they're very important, but yet we see this other world where they seem not to matter. So I think as we try to understand the proper balance, we have to understand these other, admittedly kind of unusual creative endeavors.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.